This series of videos introduces the 38 chapters of the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. It's a project of the Social Change Lab, and we gratefully acknowledge the support of the Mary Lee Bequest for the work of our team. Hi, everyone. I'm Winifred Lewis. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Queensland.
Hello, and I'm Shu. I'm an undergraduate student studying psychology at UQ.
Hello, I'm Sarah Picard, and I'm a senior lecturer and researcher at the Sorbonne Nouvelle in Paris.
I'm Ben Bowman. I'm at the Manchester Centre for Youth Studies at Manchester Metropolitan University, where I'm also a senior lecturer in the sociology department.
And hello, my name is Dana Aria. I'm a doctoral researcher in politics at Nottingham Trent University in the UK.
And it's particularly exciting to have these folks here because Shu and I have been involved with others at UQ in an ongoing project to record videos about every chapter in the Routledge Handbook of Environmental Movements. And now we're up to the chapter on youth activism, and these are the authors, yes, waving the book around proudly, as you can see. Tell us about the work that led you into this chapter.
So the story of our research here really starts, unlike the young environmental movement, which has lots deeper roots, our work really started in 2018 and 2019 with the wave of school strikes that kind of we're talking for action on climate change around the world. And we were already working very closely with young people in our fieldwork, but those climate strikes were really fascinating and I think inspiring to us. And so we leapt up and tried our best to work with young people that we met at the climate strikes. So around the different places that we worked, we conducted interviews, we asked questions about strike posters and placards and took pictures of those. We did a lot of work to listen to young people. And so the work that we've been continuing to do is really around this kind of fieldwork. Yeah, so the chapter in the handbook comes straight out of our fieldwork, and we were really excited and really grateful to work with the young people as part of that project. Yeah,
I know you kind of rushed over this question earlier, but one of the questions that comes to me as a reader of the chapter is, you know, who is a young person? Is Shu a young person?
Do you want me to chip in?
go ahead.
Well, that's an eternal debate within youth studies and political participation and you know, politicians themselves. And it's a very moot point because if you go from the young people themselves who we interviewed, there were young people up to the age of 34 who we interviewed who consider themselves to be young people. That's because, of course, because of precarity, because they haven't got their own home, some of them haven't left home, they're not economically independent, etc. So you know that the period of youth has been expanding over the last few decades. The transitions have taken longer and longer, and that's been exacerbated by, of course, the financial crisis and the Great Recession and then austerity measures around the world. And so that's kind of expanding upwards, this feeling of still being young because they're not autonomous financially or stable. And then if you go down, well, there's no particular low limit about when somebody starts being young, but it's also very contentious because within politics, you know, the right to vote and social security measures. So, you know, Bourdieu said youth is just a name. It's a social construction. And so whether you come from psychology, it's developmental psychology, whether you come from political science and it's more about voting and citizenship, or whether you come from youth studies where we see it as something much more holistic, where you have to take on board biology, sociology, psychology, political science, political socialization. So people would like to have a neat definition, but it doesn't exist. And it doesn't exist, but also it's important, I'll just chip in, but this is that, you know, it's important with the status of young people and how power holders see them and react to them, and that if you're not a voting age, you're not necessarily on their radar, or if you take up political actions, you're disruptive. And we mentioned it in the chapter that some politicians like Donald Trump or Scott Morrison in Australia kind of trying to undermine young people's climate activism because it's disruptive and it's uncomfortable for them, and it's calling politicians to account. And so the actual youth there's no real definition of it, but it's important to understand that what we've noticed, and that comes out in this chapter and in our interviews, that there are people under the age of voting who are quite capable of having mature, reasoned thoughts about what's going wrong, why it's going wrong, and what needs to be done. Yeah?
We did
Go
have
ahead,
some,
Ben.
we had some technical approaches to youth. So while I agree with Sarah, it's really impossible to say, well, youth is this date to this date, because it's socially constructed, including by young people themselves who will say, I need a place at this table because I'm young. And it's that process of asking for a place that really defines youth for them. For our fieldwork, we had some restrictions. So number one, we tried to start from age 16. And that's because although we saw younger people and children speaking on platforms, holding microphones, holding politicians to account, we didn't think that in our fieldwork we had the time to build that relationship of trust and care with younger children. And we thought that it was more respectful that if they were under 16, we didn't interview them. I mean, we had that technical limitation. They were still doing the work, but we were a bit different in the way that we interviewed. And then on the higher end of the age spectrum, as people got older, we found really that they were calling themselves parents or grandparents, or you know, that it was different for people who were older. I think in our fieldwork in different projects, we tended to define the upper age differently, but it tended to fall in the early 30s. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't mean to certainly, imply that there was needed to be a hard and fast definition, but I appreciate very much the context that you provide. And just to jump ahead a little bit, one of the points that you made, Sarah, that people were really indignant that youth were protesting, I think is a feature of the chapter, really. Will you tell us a little bit about what the young people were doing and how people reacted?
Yeah, I'll just say that Dana and I did actually interview young people together who were under 16 with their parents in attendance, but it's a whole different ethical issue, because even when we interview people who are over 18, we have to do ethical consent and things, and it's quite a few obstacles. But Dana and I did interviews with under 16s with their parents in attendance, and that's why asking them about placards is a good way to kind of overcome some of the barriers about, can you sign this ethical consent form? You can leave when you want, whatever. Dana, do you want to talk about some of the things that they did?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to give it a little bit of context, the interviews that we carried out were at different protests, sometimes run by Fridays for Future, otherwise known as Youth Strike for Climate, sometimes run by either youth wings or adult wings of Extinction Rebellion. And they were in places such as Manchester, Nottingham, Edinburgh, Paris, London, mostly in the time that Ben has already explained, in that height of protests in 2018 to 2019. And so there were lots of different kinds of activities and actions that young people could be involved in those different spaces. There were rallies, there were marches, there were discussions happening in pockets whilst waiting, for example, for speeches to come on. And so when we went to talk to and to interview young people for this particularly for the different kinds of research projects that we did after, they would usually be before or after the protest. So whilst they had time to kind of sit really and digest and process the experience they'd had and talk to us. Is there anything I may be missing, Sarah or Ben, that you'd want to add there just about the kinds of things they were doing?
Yeah, well, yeah, I also interviewed people during an occupation of a shopping centre in Paris through the night, where there was Extinction Rebellion and the Yellow Vests, the Gilets Jaunes, in Trafalgar Square with Extinction Rebellion. We did school climate strikes, Fridays for Futures. Subsequently, we've been to COP26 as well, but that was after the chapter was published. So in all different places, all different types of people, whether they were, doing direct action or about to march, or lots of different things to get a wide.
It's like putting this in context for people that might not have that detail at their fingertips. So from 2018 onwards, there have been these two big waves of youth activism, one being Fridays for Future, a movement of literally millions of youth all around the world in over 100 countries. And the key request is kind of that politicians stop procrastinating and take action on the climate and listen to scientists. And the other major movement highlighted in the chapter and by other chapters in the handbook is Extinction Rebellion. And that is a movement that highlights that we are hurtling towards extinction, and we should rebel against the systems that are allowing this to happen. And Extinction Rebellion, like a lot of the climate action in the last decade, has turned more towards direct action out of a sense that conventional actions aren't working. And that's something that in the chapter comes out very clearly, that there are a range of tactics that people are using that are different from what people have done before. Creative performative protest and direct actions. Do you guys want to talk a little about that?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, that the distinction between 2018 and before is not so much about that activism being carried out or people taking action on climate change. It's rather, I think, the way that the wider world, and particularly older adults in power, view them has changed. So you could put that date at 2018 and say this is when youth activism started because of Greta Thunberg. But you could also put it at 2016 because of Standing Rock, or you could have put it at 2014 because that's when Kathy Yetniel-Kiyiner spoke to the UN about climate change, young Marshall Islands poet. So really what we have is a long history of activism involving and sometimes led by young people. And it's at 2018, I think, that we would mark a watershed moment, not in the activism, because that's continued, but really in that, first of all, that kind of global wave of interest and as you say, the sheer number of mobilizations of young people, but also the ways that, say, the media or adults in general have kind of reflected on them. Sarah, go.
Yeah, exactly. And but also, the young climate activists now are building on generations of activism. It didn't just start in 2018, but neither did young people's involvement in it. It's just that there's been a change. Certain factors. One, first of all, obviously the global warming or climate change has got worse. Second, that there are more young people educated, especially in the global north, and not education per se acts as a mobilizer, but being in spaces where there are other young people in an educational environment creates a kind of greenhouse effect for encouraging environmental activism, all kinds of activism. But you've also, of course, you've got digital technologies that have come along that have made it much easier to inform, be informed, communicate, care, share, and get together. And that's why Greta Thunberg, a 15-year-old, managed to get this kind of critical mass, because straight away she was on Instagram and Twitter, and media coverage of her, The Guardian, just a month afterwards, and then the rest is history. And then it comes along Extinction Rebellion. So all of that against the backdrop of young people feeling that, most existentially, but also economically and socially, that their lives are endangered, and that's not being done enough. So against this backdrop of politicians not caring about their personal livelihoods comes this much bigger environmental thing that maybe Dena's really good at talking about that. So I'll hand over.
Sure, thanks, Sarah. Well, just a couple of thoughts I had around this question when I heard about tactics. There's the different groups of young people that we spoke to over the time that we did research showed to us that direct action isn't the ultimate goal of all activists. So not all young people are aiming towards building up to becoming direct action activists. There are socioeconomic inequalities, racial inequalities, social inequalities and injustices that mean that there are young people who would not go for direct action tactics for very particular and good reasons. And some of the debate around Extinction Rebellion's direct action tactics have brought up that issue of, well, how can young people coming from different social positions, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different racial backgrounds participate in a way that is fair? So that what I mean by that is there will be young people who cannot get arrested. Looking in the UK context, for example, where we know that non-white young people are more likely to get stopped and searched, are more likely to be arrested, and the kinds of consequences and repercussions for them would be different. And so thinking about that and thinking about the tactics that different young people engage with, that really depends on a lot of factors, but also their position in society and justice issues they're dealing with.
Such an important point. I want to kind of wrap up this first part of the, before I get to you, Sarah, by inviting Shu to just kind of throw out a question or a comment. It's hard to summarize this chapter, and we're going to go right into depth in part 2 almost immediately. But when I think of this chapter as a whole, I guess I see part of the message being the point that we've come back to a couple of times, that young people are marginalized. People don't expect them to act. And when they act, they can be effective and powerful, creative and innovative. And that's just important to say. What about you, Shu? What are some comments or questions you have at this point about the overall message of the chapter?
It's quite interesting because we see that environmentalism as a movement is becoming a lot more prevalent, not just amongst people who are younger than the protesters of previous generations, but it's a lot more spread out with the use of technology. And I'm just wondering if there are any differences really between then and now in terms of the tactics being used.
Yeah, the internet especially, it's a really important point that you guys touched on. Sarah, I'm going to throw it over to you to answer. Oh, Ben, Sarah wanted to speak earlier though. Yeah.
I'll let you go, Ben, first, and then I'll chip in. You first, Ben.
I was only going to say that for me, and as we've written elsewhere, the main tactic and the main kind of development that I see in young environmentalism, distinct from other groups in some ways, is kindness. And that kind of huge wave of kind of love and care for each other that you see both on the street at a climate strike and also in the work of young people who don't strike, whether it's at schools or at lunch tables in the cafeteria or among friends. You see this going on. And I think, as we've written elsewhere, and I think we mentioned it in the chapter, this is because young people are justice activists. They don't want to sustain the world that we've got. They want to build a better one. And they're in the process of thinking about how do we support each other to build a world that isn't racist and sexist, that doesn't have these the enduring damage of colonialism across the world. How can we imagine a better world? And they start out with that imagining by working together and sharing with each other, which I think has been the main thing that comes out of our work, I think. Sarah?
Yeah, yes. We've written something called Radical in Our Kindness, which is a quote from a young activist interviewed in Trafalgar Square and asking about radical tactics, because the aim of particularly Extinction Rebellion is to be disruptive, not to be disruptive just for disruptive, but to attract media, public and political attention, which they have obviously been successful in doing because of all the media coverage and certain measures have been taken. But yeah, peaceful, direct action, building on previous generations and what we talked about in the chapter about do-it-ourselves politics, where it's young people taking, not only young people, but particularly environmental activists, taking things into their own hands because they consider that politicians and other power holders and gatekeepers are not doing so. And so there's a visceral existential need to do something, just not to sit by. And we've interviewed people who have this existential need to do something because they're anxious, and then they become angry, and the doing something helps their emotional way of keeping with it because they're not being inactive, but they're finding other solidarities, other young people, that gives them a sense of hope and joy that not everybody is supportive of the current status quo. And so this do-it-ourselves politics, which comes from like individual actions, but feeling part of a wider global movement, this coming together of collective movements, which is not new to environmental movements, but the critical mass that we've seen around the linking of the global north and the global south and being connected, going back to Shu's question about how digital technologies and social media are a force for good in this kind of thing, to feel a sense of belonging and have a sense of agency and to be able to do something. And that it does have an impact. So yes, of course, digital medias are crucial, and especially during, and Den has written about this, during COVID, that, the activism actions didn't stop. They carried on in a different way. But as we saw in COP26, the joy of being able to find people again and to take part. So But I come back to the fact that the young people are doing this is because they feel that those that are in power are not doing it, are not doing what needs to be done. And whether it's Fridays for Future, Extinction Rebellion, or others, they're not that different in what they want. They want system change, radical change to how things are done. And it's just that, you know, if you see Fridays for Future, it's the same goals and the same targets. It's just different ways of doing it to get to the same thing.
Well, I think that's an inspiring moment at which we can pause and say, you know, this is the end of part one. So I'll just pause it and say thank you to Shu. She did message me that she's had to step away from the keyboard. It's not a rejection of our group and our conversation. She'll be back. But thank you to Sarah, Ben, and Dana for contributing to part one, and thank you to Shu.
For those of you watching, be sure to subscribe and follow us at Social Change UQ, and check out our website for more videos.